I wasn't able to talk about my repatriation experience until I was 70. The devastation in Ukraine and the images of refugees fleeing their country remind me of my past self. I wasn't able to talk about my repatriation experience until I was 70. The devastation in Ukraine and the images of refugees fleeing their country remind me of my past self. Hiroyuki Itsuki, August 12, 2022. Relationships. Interview Hiroyuki Itsuki. I wasn't able to talk about my repatriation experience until I was 70. The devastation in Ukraine and the images of refugees fleeing their country remind me of my past self. Wars continue all over the world. Hiroyuki Itsuki, author. War, social issues. Author, Ukraine. Hiroyuki Itsuki. We must be careful about what we say about Ukraine and Russia. This unspoken pressure may be stronger now than it has been since World War II. Hiroyuki Itsuki, who spent the end of the war on the Korean Peninsula, says he wasn't able to share his brutal repatriation experience with anyone until he was 70 years old. 77 years have passed since the end of the war, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues to drag on. Here are his thoughts, written by Yuri Chernoto. In a world where a silence-filled atmosphere pervades, August 15th is fast approaching again. This year, Ukraine. This makes me feel even more depressed because of the issues surrounding the issue. I see myself in the images of refugees fleeing their country. Before I get into that, I'd like to share a few thoughts about my experiences with this war. Let's jump ahead to the Russo-Japanese War. At the time, Japanese people used derogatory terms like Razuk, Russian for Russian. At the same time, Russian literature was being widely translated and capturing the hearts of young writers. The poet Hakushu Kitahara, who was born in Chikugo like me, had a unique literary companion in his youth. His real name was Naka. Shurzwa Nakajima, whose pen name was Haku, had been studying Russian on his own, wanting to read works by Turgenev and others in the original. However, with the Russo-Japanese War approaching and the prevailing sentiment of defeating Russia, the young Nakajima was falsely accused of being a Russian spy. Unable to bear the pressure, 3 days after Japan declared war on Russia, he stabbed himself in the throat with a dagger, committing suicide at the age of 19. Hakushu carried his body on a wooden board to his house along a road lined with dandelions. He wrote about the anguish of the times in his poem, Dandelion. It seems as though an atmosphere similar to the one that drove this young man to his knees is now spreading throughout the world. While there are many people in Japan who love Russian literature, including Dostoevsky, it feels like any discussion of Russia is now taboo. In fact, one orchestra canceled a performance of Tchaikovsky's music, and there have even been reports of people attacking Russian restaurants. Most recent wars are proxy wars. War, social issues. Author, Ukraine. Hiroyuki Itsuki. The unspoken pressure to be careful about what we say about Ukraine and Russia may be stronger now than it has been since World War II. It's a depressing feeling, with media figures and ordinary people alike being forced to speak with discretion, fearing they'll be criticized for saying something. When I thought about the Ukraine situation, I immediately thought of the Spanish Civil War, 1936–39, and wrote about the similarities in several media outlets. This civil war was fought between the left-wing Popular Front government and the right-wing rebel forces led by General Franco. Intellectuals and cultural figures from around the world, including Hemingway, fought as volunteers for the Popular Front. The anti-fascist Popular Front was supported by the Soviet Union and Mexico, while Germany, Italy, and Portugal supported Franco's camp and fought there. Although it was a civil war, it had a strong proxy war feel. It's well known that Pablo Picasso, shocked by the indiscriminate bombings by the German army, painted his masterpiece, Guernica. Recent wars, it's no exaggeration to say that most of these wars are proxy wars. It's as if they say, we'll provide the money, we'll provide the weapons, but you're the ones who'll shed the blood. This is true of Afghanistan and Syria, and even now, while the actual fighting is between Russia and Ukraine, it feels like a third world war is taking shape. If you think about it, wars have continued all over the world since World War II. The global capitalist economy cannot function without consumption. Ironically, the world's major powers are constantly at war somewhere, acting like a sustainable development plan. Japan, too, experienced a booming economy during World War I, generating a flood of nouveau riche. Furthermore, thanks to the booming demand caused by the Korean War, they achieved post-war economic recovery. Wars in other countries are like honey. Isn't this the fateful structure of modern society? The 20th century was the era of deracination. The era of refugees continues to this day. Everyone reacted with anger to the news of the massacre of civilians in Ukraine. You probably do. During World War II, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. The Great Tokyo Air Raid killed over 100,000 civilians in one night. The U.S. Air Force first dropped bombs on the perimeter of the planned bombing area, preventing escape, and then carpet-bombed the area within. This was genocide in its purest form. Why kill non-combatants? For example, female students were mobilized to work in weapons manufacturing, while civilians practiced bamboo spear training. Since they cooperated with the war, they were considered to be the same as combatants. Also, Ukrainian President Zelensky issued a national mobilization order, essentially banning men between the ages of 18 and 60 from leaving the country. However, some men have reportedly tried to escape the country disguised as women, determined not to kill anyone. If they were discovered, they would probably be treated as traitors. I don't want to kill. Is not acceptable. That's war. I've always used the word deraciny. When I say deraciny, I mean someone who leaves their homeland against their will. These are people who were forcibly separated from their homeland. For example, there was a group called the Crimean Tatars on the Crimean Peninsula, but during Stalin's reign, they were forcibly relocated to Siberia and other places. Similar examples abound around the world. The 20th century was, so to speak, the age of deracination, and it continues to this day. Many people in Japan are deeply concerned about the Ukrainian refugee crisis, driven by humanism. However, I am deeply troubled by the current lack of concern for Muslims, Asians, and Africans, who should receive the same level of attention, for example, from Syrian and Myanmar refugees. Abandoned by my country in Pyongyang after the war. I don't want to remember the events from the war's defeat until I return to Japan. This is because when people risk their lives to flee, they try to survive even by using others as stepping stones. Blocked negative memories. As I mentioned briefly at the beginning, I myself was once a refugee. Or should I say abandoned people instead of refugees? Before the war, my father was in Pyongyang, Korea. I was a teacher at a teacher's school in Pyongyang. I was 12 years old at the time, and I noticed planes heading to Japan taking off one after another a few days before the imperial rescript on the surrender of the war. Military leaders, high-ranking bureaucrats, trading company executives, and their families were returning to the mainland one after another. However, the radio repeatedly warned, "Citizens, please do not act rashly. Public order will be maintained, so please remain where you are." Believing these words, my family and I remained in Pyongyang, idly, even after August 15th. Later, when I learned that the official repatriation effort had been suspended because a mass evacuation by the residents would cause chaos in the mainland, meaning that we had been abandoned by the country, I felt intense anger. The Soviet army entered Pyongyang and disarmed the Japanese troops in mid-September. The Japanese soldiers who had laid down their weapons were sent to Siberia one by one. From then on, until the regular army arrived, Soviet soldiers on the front lines committed acts of violence and mayhem. In the midst of this chaos, I lost my mother. The sense of guilt has stayed with me for the rest of my life. It never fades. After being kicked out of our home, we lived in a camp-like environment for a while, where we experienced unspeakable things, like the spread of typhus. Realizing that there was no hope of repatriation if we continued to wait, my father, who was listless from the shock of losing our mother, and my younger brother and sister, attempted to escape North Korea. We failed twice, but on the third try, we finally managed to walk across the 38th parallel. I don't want to remember the events that occurred between the defeat and our return to Japan. When humans risk their lives to escape, they try to survive even if it means using others as stepping stones. For example, if a truck can only fit 3 people and 5 people try to get on, the first person to get on has to kick the back 2 in the head. People with a please go first mentality will not survive. That's why I say, kind-hearted people never returned. I was still just a boy at the time, but I believe the sense of guilt that was engraved in me at that time will never fade. Even after my debut as a writer, I continued to write about my experiences. I couldn't write about it in a novel. I finally wrote an essay about some of my experiences at the age of 70, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't regret writing it. I'm not the only one. More than 5 million repatriates kept silent. In former Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula, some groups offered women to Soviet soldiers to protect their lives. Some mothers were asked to sell their children and tearfully gave them up, thinking it would be better to save their children's lives than to lose everyone together. Such truly painful and negative memories had no choice but to be sealed away. Some have published memoirs, but there are no proper official records of the repatriates' history. Once the next generation is left to tell the tales, the truth will fade away. From the age of the gods to the present, history has been portrayed arbitrarily by those in power. That's why inconvenient stories, or stories that people kept quiet about due to their pain, are ignored. I've always thought that writing is a terrible thing. He says that the history we know is fiction, and that the true history lies in the memories of each individual. That's why it's so meaningful to pass on these stories. My Mother's Enemy, why I majored in Russian literature. People are both good and evil. There's an unforgettable sight I saw in Pyongyang. The first Soviet soldiers to arrive after the war were said to be prisoners of war. They were tattooed, had a rough appearance, and had no military discipline whatsoever. As I was absent-mindedly watching this group return to their barracks in the evening, someone suddenly started singing. The song naturally evolved into a 2-part chorus, then a 3-part chorus, creating a beautiful harmony. Until then, I had only ever known unison singing, where everyone sang a single melody with all their might. Hearing this harmony for the first time in my life, I felt a numbness in my entire body, unable to move. Aren't beautiful songs born from beautiful hearts? What on earth could it be that these beastly people could sing such beautiful songs? Written by Yuri Chernoto.